And Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to Theological Discussion. And what we have here right now is inspiring philosophy. He is the man who has philosophy that's inspiring. It's inspiring philosophy. Say hello to everybody.
Hey, how you doing?
And then in the other corner, he's a wolf that's on fire, and he wears a crown and has the cross of Saint Peter on his face. Speaking of which, you better give us Christians back that cross. We don't need atheists or Satanists taking what belonged to us, but hey, it's Wolf King.
Greetings to all.
Alright, so the structure is going to go like this. Since it was Inspiring's topic, he's going to go first, and he has 2 minutes to explain his position on the topic of the reliability of the New Testament, and then Wolf will get 2 minutes to explain his views, and then it goes to a 30-minute conversation between Inspiring and Wolf. So whenever you're ready, Inspiring, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I would like to clarify what the actual topic is. It's the reliability of the New Testament, not the truth of the New Testament. And how I would define reliability in this sense is it's reliable to what the original authors wrote. It goes back to what the original authors thought, what they believed in, and what they originally wrote down. Now we can debate on a different topic, and a different debate, if it was true, if they were diluted, if they made it all up when they were writing it. But for the sake of this topic, all I would argue is basically the reliability of the New Testament, that what has been handed down in the manuscript tradition has been preserved to its accuracy. And what I find in this is, the basic objections to this have boiled down to, well, not all of them, but the two biggest categories of what I get of objections are just the basic skepticism you'll get without any real evidence behind it, just kind of like the claim that it's to be skeptical just because you can. And then the double standard argument, the idea that we're going to treat the New Testament a different way than we would treat other ancient documents. And I think if we look at the New Testament and we judge it as we look it up, the same way we would judge other ancient documents, and if we actually look at the manuscript evidence we have, as well as the early attestation and what the Gospels themselves list, like key little things in there, there overwhelming evidence that it's been reliable, and I'm currently in the middle of a 6-part series on the New Testament reliability. So that would be my basic position, is that the New Testament is reliable to what it's originally wrote. And I'm not saying that proves it's true. Like, I can believe Tacitus, what we have now is what he originally wrote, without believing all of his theological conclusions in it. Would basically, there's a distinction there. A lot of times Christians and atheists will confuse reliability with truth. So I just want to clarify what I'm arguing for is truth, for reliability, not truth yet. Reliability has to be established first.
Alright, that was Inspiring's view. Wolf, you have 2 minutes starting now to explain your point.
Yes. So yes, I'll be, I guess, playing devil's advocate in this case with regard to the New Testament. I think, speaking as just a secular thinker on this, is that I feel like the New Testament, while I guess philosophically speaking is interesting, I would say you have to take it just as a source with a grain of salt, the way we take all of the sources. I feel like there are certain issues that actually can be scrutinized, like, for example, the alleged life of the particular historical figure of Jesus, including his supposed life, including the fact that certain various sources seem to be non-contemporary, and the other New Testament writings, like the Epistle of Paul, Epistle of Galatians, and James and John, even in antiquity, people like Origen and Eusebius raised doubts over the authenticity of other books in the New Testament, such as Hebrews, James, John 2 and 3. and Revelation, various others. Even Martin Luther rejected the Epistle of James, calling it worthless, an epistle of straw, and questioned Jude and Hebrews and Apocalypse and Revelation. They came well after the death of Jesus from unknown authors, with the possible exception of Paul, although still after his death. So I think there is room for scrutiny. There is room to question, and I don't think that it's taboo to, talk about these things. I think it's only fair we could dare to know.
All right. Thank you. Cool. All right. So, 30 minutes. You two are just going to go back and forth and conversate on this topic. Starting now.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Basically, this is kind of what I was talking about in the beginning. That it's just kind of like this mere skepticism of the New Testament. There maybe we can doubt these books or that books because so and so may have doubted it or whatnot, and that to me really isn't an argument. If we would apply that to like Tacitus or Suetonius, Josephus, we'd have to throw out all ancient history, because when it comes to the New Testament, we have so much manuscript evidence, and we have a more eternal attribution to it than any other ancient document. You include all languages, so we have 24,000 plus manuscripts of it. That is very far and very wide, and we also have our earliest fragments of the New Testament. The earliest fragments we have of the New Testament go back to within a couple hundred years, and for example, the Book of John, it's less than 50 years from when it was originally wrote. Some even say it was written. The earliest fragment we have is very close, like within a decade or so, but there's debate about that. But all agree that it's at least within 50 years, our earliest fragment. So just this idea that we can just doubt just because it seems like some later author doubted it doesn't really add up. For example, First Clement, which is dated to 95 AD, alludes to the Book of James. It doesn't seem like it was, it would be unreliable in that sense. Would you disagree with that, Wolf?
Would I disagree with what in particular, like the Epistle of James?
Well, not so much that in general. I mean, would you say the Epistle? I mean, you've kind of taken one book out of it. I mean, would you say the Epistle of James is unreliable to what it originally was?
Although the Epistle identify James as the letter writer, which James exactly? Because many claim him as the gospel disciple, but the Gospels mention several different James. So which one?
Well, I mean, you could always, the time being. I mean, I'm just asking you, do you think it's been corrupted over the ages, or do you think it's original to what it originally wrote?
I mean, see, the thing is with the New Testament, just in terms of like the several epistles. I mean, they come in sketchy because like just the epistle of James alone. I mean, James served as a common name in the first centuries, and biblical scholars simply have no way to tell who this James actually refers to. More to the point, the Epistle of James mentions Jesus only once as an introduction to his belief. Nowhere does the epistle reference anything like historical to the account. So,
well, I mean,
I wouldn't say that it. I mean, it's sketchy at best.
Well, I mean, the Epistle of James doesn't really talk about that. It's talking about other issues in the church. I mean, that would be the fact that it doesn't mention certain things would just be an argument from silence, if that's what you're saying.
I mean, if this is, I mean, there were biographers and and people who could actually record this, and the fact that it just tends to be just poorly kept. I mean, it's actually kind of staggering in a way, kind of flabbergasting.
You would say that because no early author mentions the Epistle of James, it's unreliable?
I'm saying that because it doesn't specify a specific James. It's there is room for questioning this.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying. So, do you know who wrote the Annals of the Annals? Do you know who wrote the Annals from the Ancient World?
The Annals from the Ancient World? No.
The Annals was written by Tacitus. Do you know how we know that?
Because I trust that he most likely left his signature at an accurate time.
No, the reason why we know it is because every manuscript we have says it's attributed to him, kind of like a title at the top. Like when we find every Gospel of Luke, it says at the top, the Gospel according to Luke, and then it starts into the Gospel. We don't think that was actually a title was originally in the Gospel of Luke. We're pretty sure that was added by scribes later to clarify. That was the tradition handed down. Same with the Annals of Tacitus. The reason why we would attribute it is because every manuscript we have, which is far later than when Tacitus wrote it, would say that. And the first time we actually have attribution to Tacitus' Annals is not till St. Jerome, which is plus 300 years from when he originally wrote it.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, I understand that the Gospels are the authoritative accounts of the New Testament. We understand that they did not come into the Bible as original or and authoritative from the authors themselves, but rather the influence from the early church fathers. But that's neither here nor there. You also invoked the apostles Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John. But we understand that scholars know from critical textual research that these particular gospel authors couldn't have served as the apostles described in the gospel stories. Yet even today we hear priests and ministers describing these authors as the actual disciples of Christ.
Well,
yet
why would you say that? I mean, there's actually a lot of debate. I'm currently reading a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, written by Richard Bachman. And E.P. Sanders, who's not a Christian, would also agree that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts in that sense. So, there is debate. It's not like it's unanimous scholarship that they're not written by actual eyewitness accounts. There's actually a lot of good arguments that you could put forward to show they are.
Yes, but we understand that no apostle could have announced his own sainthood before the church's establishment of sainthood. I mean, that's a contradiction. I mean, one need not refer to the scholars themselves to determine the lack of evidence for authorship. I mean, imagine. Just hold on. Like, just for the thought experiment. Imagine the Gospels without their titles. I mean, just see if you could find out from the text who wrote them. Try to find their names. Even if the texts support the notion that the apostles wrote them, consider the low life expectancy of humans during the first century. According to religious scholar J.D. Strowan, the life expectancy of Jewish males in the Jewish state was then 29 years. So I mean, it's honestly, I mean, there are a series of factors actually taken into place when we're just trying to construct a story like this. And it's,
okay, so two things on that. First of all, the life expectancy would have been lowered because of infant rate deaths. I mean, in Rome, for example, half the children die before the age of 15. That would have lowered the overall life expectancy rate. But people who lived beyond that did not all die at 29. They would have lived longer, and we actually have reports of men living into their 70s or 80s. We know the old early church, for example, testifies that John lived until he was about 80 or so. And second of all, regarding that, these people were not in the hard labor anymore. They became ministers of the word. They were preaching, they were writing, they were leading the church. They weren't out in the fields anymore. They weren't out fishing anymore. They weren't doing dangerous things like a soldier would do. And on that, I mean, yeah, I know that this was not a very, you could argue that they were illiterate, but, for example, Seneca, Tacitus, all these people wrote via a scribe. They didn't actually write themselves. Everyone used scribes. So it's perfectly reasonable the gospel authors wrote via a scribe. They would have just spoken it out. They would have just said, and they would have had the scribe write it for them. And we know that the early church had a lot of Greek converts. I mean, for example, even Bart Ehrman and Gerhard Ludemann admit that. That's pretty much a unanimous point on that point. So, and a lot of them were educated. For example, Acts says like an off-the-cuff comment about Paul getting up a collection to take back to the Jerusalem church. So these were not just a lot of them were poor, but not all of them were. And there was evidence in the gospel that Christians that were Gentile, they were tradesmen, and they were not necessarily poor. So they could have easily had scribes in there that translated for them. And I'm pretty sure that just about every scholar notes that ancient writers, dictated to a scribe to write for them. That wouldn't have been an issue.
Well, according to the source and the historian Richard Carrier, we have reason to believe that only 4% of the population at any given time was over 50 years old, over 70 years of age, or less than 2%. And that's under normal circumstances. But the Gospels, keep in mind, they were written after two very devastating abnormal events: the Jewish War and the Neronian persecution, both of which have combined greatly reduced the life expectancy of exactly people who were eyewitnesses to the the main teachings of the New Testament. And it just so happens that these sorts of people are curiously missing from the historical record precisely when the Gospels began to be circulated. Even if they lived to those unlikely ages, consider the mental and physical toll, especially during the first century, which would likely reduce their memory and capability to write. Moreover, those small percentages of people who lived past 50 years were usually wealthy people, like aristocrats, politicians, land and slave owners. However, the gospel suggests that the followers of Jesus lived poorly, and this would further reduce the chances for them to live a long lifespan. Although New Testament did not provide the ages of the disciples, most Christians think the ages were around, like as you said or mentioned, 20 to 30 years old. But Jesus' birth would have occurred before Herod's death, which is or before the Common Era.
Well,
so yeah,
a couple things on that. First of all, I mean, the gospel. We know that in the book of Acts, for instance, records that the apostles first of all spread out. They weren't still centered in Judea. The only one who was really centered in Judea we have recorded by Josephus is James the Just, and he died in 62 A.D. when he was thrown off the Temple Mount and stoned to death. And we know, for example, that John was living in Ephesus when he wrote. Paul had moved around the ancient world. Peter was martyred in Rome. This is recorded by the first letter of Clement, which dates to 95 A.D. And that's pretty much accepted by the majority of scholars. Regarding the age thing, I mean, again, that's not entirely that's not entirely accepted on that fact. I mean, yeah, the ancient poor did not live nearly as long, but you need to remember that a lot of that is the overall general population. You know, most children would have died before they hit the age of 15, but if you live past that, you had a pretty good shot of going even further than that. I mean, that's not necessarily a given that people would have lived that long. I mean, I'm not doubting it. But again, I'm not saying all the apostles lived well past that age. I mean, by the time John writes, for example, Richard Bachman will point out that the reason John does not list the 12 disciples like Matthew, Mark, and Luke does is by the time he's writing, they had already been martyred. So Peter and Paul, we know, were martyred in Rome around the Nero persecution, so they didn't live that much longer. And regarding John, I mean, he probably wasn't 30. I mean, a lot of disciples, you didn't have to be 30 to be a disciple. We tend to think, evidence seems to think John was very young when he was a disciple of Jesus. He could have, you were considered a man in Jewish culture by the time you hit, I forget, it's like 12 or 13. I'm not up to date on that, but it was young in your teens. So, a man would have been anywhere between, would also be considered a teenager in that sense.
Okay, well, just focusing on the particular claims with just the authors in general. I mean, there is room for a skeptical eye. The author of Matthew had obviously gotten his information from Mark's gospel and used them for his own needs. He fashioned his narrative to appeal to Jewish tradition and scripture. He improved it from the grammar of Mark's gospel and corrected what he felt was theologically important, and actually heightened the miracles and the acts of providence, so to speak. The author of Luke admits himself as an interpreter of earlier material and an eyewitness himself. You can check Luke chapter 1, verse 1 to 4. Many scholars actually think that the author of Luke lived as a Gentile, or at the very least a Hellenized Jew. Some scholars think that the Gospel of Matthew and Luke came from the Mark Gospel and a hypothetical document called Q.
Right.
However, hold on. Since we have no manuscript from Q, no one could possibly determine its author or where or how he got his information or the date of its authorship. Moreover, those other scholars challenge its existence, and those who do think Q existed have problems explaining it. Again, we get faced with unreliable methodology and obscure sources. And finally, just real quick, John, the last appearing gospel in the Bible, presents us with long theological discourses from Jesus, and could not possibly have come as literal words from a historical narrative. The Gospel of John disagrees with events described in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Moreover, the unknown authors of this gospel wrote it in Greek near the end of the first century, and according to the Bishop Shelby Spong in the book, the carried within it a very obvious reference to the death of John Zebedee, John 21:23.
Okay, so yeah, a couple things on this. First of all, yeah, I mean, most scholars would agree that Matthew and Luke used Mark. That's not an issue for me, since Mark, the unanimous attestation of Mark said that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. Mark was simply writing down the words of Peter, and since Peter was called the Prince of the Apostles, it would make sense Matthew who would also be a disciple, could use him as a source. Now, regarding the fact that Matthew draws off of Mark, I don't see much of an issue with that. Him correcting things, I mean, that's debatable. We could get into specifics if you want to go through all those. I mean, but there are plenty of Christian responses to these supposed discrepancies. Most of them boil down to arguments from silence. One gospel mentions this effect, this one gospel mentions this, therefore they contradict. Well, I mean, if we apply that standard to like Josephus and Suetonius, we have to conclude that the expulsion of Jews in 49 AD by Claudius didn't happen because Josephus didn't mention that. Josephus mentions an entire history of the Jewish, leaves out a very big event like that. And the only record we have of it is in the book of Acts and from Suetonius. Why would Josephus leave out something like that? It doesn't really add up. Yeah, Luke used sources for his gospel. No one denies that. No one. I think maybe you might find someone in the woodworks who denies that. But Luke opens by saying he gets it from the ministers of the word. And the word he uses is hazans, which means it's a word that would be used for keepers of the scrolls. These were carefully selected individuals who were guarded with protecting this tradition that had been handed down. So yeah, of course Luke used sources. Of course he was a Gentile convert, and no one would have denied that. I mean, regarding Q, I mean, if we were to apply this skepticism for Q as we do with like Arian or Plutarch, because we don't know where Arian and Plutarch got a lot of those sources for Alexander the Great. Plutarch says he got it from soldier stories, but we don't know where they came from. We don't know how he got them because Plutarch is writing much later than Alexander the Great. A lot of our sources are missing from the ancient world. It's hard for us to just piece them all together. So if we were to apply the standard you're applying to Q in the Gospels, we would have to throw out a lot of ancient documents, stuff we know about the ancient world, stuff we only know about the ancient world from like people like Josephus, Suetonius, Herodotus, historians like that. So I don't know if that really works. Yeah, the Gospels use early sources, but every ancient historian we have used early sources, and the fact that they are written in Greek makes perfect sense. Greek was the written language of the ancient world at that time. It was used, we know, in Palestine because tax collectors needed to know Greek because the records were written in Greek. So, for example, a tax collector in Judea would need to know Aramaic as well as Greek, so he had to be an educated man. And if Jesus had a tax collector as his disciple, and some argue he had several tax collectors, there's no reason to doubt they would have had these language capabilities of transcribing and things. And also tax collectors would have papyrus. They would have the money to write and to do these things. That's not an issue regarding the Greek and whatnot. And again, the discrepancies I've seen boil down to arguments from silence. If you were going to apply that to like Josephus and Suetonius, we'd have to throw them both out.
Okay. See, the main point behind this, I mean, no one's denying that there are historians that invoke writings, but the problem is virtually all other claims of that are, just post or non-New Testament come from sources that are outside of Christian writings, but they're not all non-contemporary. They actually come about well after, like decades after the alleged life of Jesus, and since they just don't live up to the accurate time set of Jesus' life, I mean, they aren't necessarily eyewitness. I mean, you mentioned Josephus. Yeah, I mean, he was a Jewish historian and lived as the earliest non-Christian who mentions Jesus, although many other scholars think that Josephus' short account of Jesus in Antiquities came from interpolations with the late church father Eusebius, I believe. His birth is actually close to the Common Era in 37 Common Era, I believe, well after the alleged crucifixion of Jesus, and puts him way out of range as an eyewitness account. Moreover, he wrote Antiquities in 93 Common Era after the first Gospels were written. So,
okay. Well, then regarding that, I mean, you kind of admit that Josephus lives a long time if he wrote by 93 and was born in 37, so there's no reason to doubt the Gospel authors would do the same. And regarding someone like Alexander the Great, we know a lot about Alexander the Great. The only reason we know so much about Alexander the Great is because historians writing 300 plus years later tell us they were not eyewitness accounts. The Gospels you can date within the lifetimes of the apostles with living eyewitnesses who would have still be around. For example, I mean, Papias testifies there were still living eyewitnesses when he wrote around 100 AD. Yes, they were very old. Yes, they couldn't travel as much, but they were still around at that point.
Yeah, I mean, granted, I agree with you that Alexander the Great is a very interesting historical figure, and the fact that he, went around and conquered several places and had statues, built of him and stuff like that. But the difference between him and Jesus and the New Testament in general is that, the sources seem to be jumbled. Like, for example, in the Epistles of Peter, many scholars question its authorship of Peter of the epistles. Even within the first epistle, it says in verse 5, chapter 5, verse 12, I believe, that Sylvanus wrote it, or that most scholars consider the second epistle as unreliable or not right forgery. For some examples, you can actually see the introduction to Second Peter. The unknown authors of the Epistle of Peter actually were written long after the life of the traditional Peter. Moreover, Peter lived as a fairly simple and illiterate peasant. Even Acts 4-13 attests to this. In short, no one has any way of determining whether or not these were fraudulent, or an author claiming himself to know what Peter said, or was Peter in fact, or if this was someone that was trying to further the aims of the church. Encyclopedias usually describe a tradition that St. Peter wrote them. However, whenever you see the word tradition, it refers to a belief passed down within a society. In other words, it essentially could be indistinguishable from heresy.
Right. I would agree that some scholars question that, but as I said earlier, I mean, ancient writers like Tacitus, Suetonius, Seneca, Josephus all wrote via scribes. So there's perhaps Peter never actually did learn to read and write, but that doesn't matter if he had scribes. For example, we know Mark was nearly the preaching of Peter. Mark was his scribe that he wrote through. So I don't really see that as an issue regarding that. Now we could debate over the internal evidence of 1st and 2nd Peter, and there's actually been a recent case made that 1st Peter was written to a scribe, that 1st Peter was written via a scribe, and then 2nd Peter was written through another scribe. That would account for differences in them. And for example, we'll see this in a lot of writings of like, Philo the Younger, or like some of the emperors who would send things out. Their letters would be different because the scribe would write different way, and a scribe would put in their own little catchwords or catchphrases to help write the letter along the way. And then, of course, the person who was originally dictating would, of course, oversee it all and make sure it agreed with what he was trying to say. So I don't really see that as a major issue. And as you said, we don't know for sure. But I don't think mere skepticism is enough to doubt the reliability, in the same way mere skepticism is not going to make me doubt Tacitus or Josephus.
Yes, well, I mean, we could just actually look at the consensus of many biblical historians putting the dating of the earliest gospel, that of Mark, at sometime after 70 Common Era.
Why did they do that, though? Do you know why they dated to 70 AD?
This would make it some 40 years after its alleged crucifixion of Jesus, that we have any gospel writings that actually mention it.
Well, why do they date it to 70 AD? Do you know why?
I mean that's just sort of how the methodology tends to work.
There's actually a reason it's dated to 70 AD, and I would challenge that directly. The reason why so many scholars dated to 70 AD, and if you go look on earlychristianwritings.com.net, I forget how it is, Early Christian Writings website, you can click on the Gospel of Mark, and it will tell you why they date it. The only reason they date it to 70 AD is because Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple that took place in 7 AD, and skeptical scholars don't want to give the admission that Jesus predicted the future accurately. So they have to put it at 70 AD because Jesus could not make a prediction, which to me is just kind of begging the question. You're just assuming naturalism. You're assuming that Jesus could not have done this. Therefore, you have to date it at 70 AD. That works if you're going to start with that presupposition. I can understand that from that standpoint. However, that's not necessarily a good argument. There's a lot of actual good internal evidence to date Mark even earlier than that. Me, personally, I would only put it at 60 AD. But I don't even think that's that too far off, considering that we have other ancient sources that are hundreds of years from the events they account. And this is well within the lifetime of the apostles. And if we study the oral tradition of the New Testament, we can actually make a pretty good case that it would be easily to be preserved in that sense.
Yes, but I mean, you would agree that the Gospel of Mark describes the first written Bible gospel, and although Mark appears deceptively after the Matthew Gospel, the Gospel of Mark got written at least a generation before Matthew. I mean, from its own words, one can deduce that the author of Mark had neither heard Jesus nor served as his personal follower. Whoever wrote the Gospel, hold on. Whoever wrote the Gospel simply accepted the story of Jesus without question and wrote a crude and ungrammatical account of the popular story at the time. Historians tell us that. Hold on. Historians tell us of the three synoptic Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
You're correct.
Mark served as the common element between Matthew and Luke and provided the main source for both of them. Of Mark's 660 verses, some 600 appear in Matthew, some 300 in Luke, but according to Randall Helms, the author of Mark, stands at least a third removed from Jesus and more likely at the fourth remove. And you also mentioned Pliny the Younger as a source for, an extra biblical source.
No, I did not. No, I did not. I did not do that. I mentioned it as a comparison. I did not say it was a source.
Okay, fine. I apologize, son.
So yeah, regarding Mark, I mean, yeah, Mark. We know Mark was not an eyewitness. I mean, Papias testifies that Eusebius, early church fathers, he was the disciple of Peter, and he wrote down the preaching of Peter. And if that's the case, then it is the testimony of Peter, and that's not necessarily an issue that it would be generations after. It would have been directly the words of an eyewitness, and that's why the early church used it, because it was the preaching of Peter, was the eyewitness account. And regarding this idea that Matthew would have came much later, that's once again not entirely supported. There's actually a lot of internal evidence. You can date Matthew and Luke prior to 70 AD, and then John, of course, possibly after. But this is the idea that Matthew would have been built off Mark is still a debated topic. We don't actually. It's actually a little trickier than a lot of skeptics think. I mean, you actually start to look at the internal evidence. I would agree in a sense with Markian priority. My view is a little different than, because I looked at a lot of the internal and external evidence. But yeah, I would kind of agree that Mark was the first gospel written, and that Matthew probably came shortly after. But the problem is that when you look at how Matthew follows Mark, it doesn't really follow Mark like Luke follows Mark. Luke follows Mark to a T, like this, let me add this in here at this point. Okay, now Mark says, let me follow him there. Matthew jumps around like crazy. You'll see him, quote, refer to like what Mark says here, and then he'll jump ahead, and then he'll come back, and then he'll jump way over here, and then he'll add a word from this or a word. It's interesting how he does that. And, I could give you my theory of, of how they're written, but I don't think that really matters for the time being. But, yeah, that's not necessarily an issue that Mark would have written first. Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, who is the prince of the apostles. He's writing down the historical account from Peter as he preached it. And then Matthew, who was also a disciple or a follower of Jesus, would have taken that and said, I'm also going to add from other eyewitness accounts, in the same way Luke would have done that. But the idea that it had to come 30, 40 years later, I don't know if it adds up. For example, Matthew is clearly written to a Jewish audience. You mentioned earlier he is trying to be a Jewish apologist. He mentions Old Testament prophecies. However, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD would have wiped out any large Jewish population that he would have been witnessing to. It would have made no sense for him to be writing a gospel to people who no longer existed, especially the Sadducees. The Sadducees were pretty much wiped out in 70 AD, and there's no record of them really going on in large portions beyond that. Matthew also doesn't really paint Rome in a bad light. If you read the book of Revelations or the Apocrypha account of the Apocalypse of Peter, these are written in anger towards Rome. They're very mad at Rome because these are going on during persecution times or after. But if you read the Gospels, for example, they're very nice to Rome. I mean, Matthew and Mark paint a Roman centurion as a guy at the cross who knows that Jesus is the Son of God. That's not something you want to paint your enemies in the light of, because he's willing to acknowledge this. They paint Roman centurions as coming to Jesus for help, being reasonable, Jesus speaking well of these people. It doesn't really match
just to comment on that real quick. Just the writings during the life of Jesus. What appears most revealing of all comes not from what people later wrote about Jesus, but what people did not write about him. Consider that not a single historian, philosopher, scribe, or follower who lived before or during the alleged life of Jesus ever mentions him. If indeed the Gospels actually portray a historical look at the life of Jesus, then the one feature that stands out prominently within the story show that people claim to know Jesus far and wide, not only by a great multitude of followers, but by the great priest, the Roman governor Pilate, and Herod, who claims that he had heard of the fame of Jesus. In Matthew,
we don't have the records from Pilate, so how would we know this? And we don't have any ancient. We don't have any current current sources for Hannibal. The only sources we have for Hannibal are Roman sources. His crossing the Alps.
One only needs. I could it's really easy. One only needs to read like Matthew 4:25, where it claims that there followed him Jesus great multitudes of people from Galilee and from the Decapolis and from Jerusalem and from Judea and from beyond Jordan. I mean, the Gospels mention countless times the great multitude that followed Jesus and crowds of people who congregated to hear him. So crowded had some of these gatherings that Luke 12:1 alleges that an innumerable multitude of people trode one upon another.
Yeah, but that's an argument.
So here we have, like, the persecution of Jesus in Jerusalem drew so much attention that the chief priests, scribes, including the high priest, not only knew about him, but helped in his alleged crucifixion, as mentioned in the New Testament.
Do we have the writings of the high priest left?
I mean,
do we have the writings
honestly,
do we have any letters of Caiaphas? I mean, the only ancient source, we have one ancient source which says for the eruption of Pompeii. That's it. It's mentioned, I think, by Pliny the Younger. We only have one source for that. This is an argument from silence. The amount of literature we have from the ancient world, it's the first century, would only fill up maybe a bookshelf, and that's the entire globe. You know, the fact that we don't have sources mentioning this or that, it's just an argument from silence. And if you were to apply that to other ancient works, you know, you would have to throw out a lot of stuff. I mean, we only Josephus, for example, is the only one who tells us about many early other, you know, Jewish rabbis who had multitudes following him. We don't dismiss that they never existed because of this. And we also have, you know, if we have Josephus, for example, mentioning that that Jesus drew large crowds to him, you know, that's multiple attestation right there if Josephus is mentioning it.
Yes, but what we understand from Josephus, as well as Pliny the Younger and the various other non-Christian sources, is that, you know, they still exist as non-contemporary, and even if they do have information about Jesus, it's usually biased, and that's coming from people who've already believed. And in fact, I mean, you know, there actually have been frauds in terms of history, like including the Shroud of Turin. You know, there were many faithful believers that actually believed the shroud was the actual burial cloth of Jesus, where they claimed the image of the cloth represents an actual photographic image, but left behind by the crucified body. But what the experts are saying is that they actually are questioning, like the shroud's authenticity, considering the people actually use it, science in fact, incongruently, and actually the dating laboratories in Zurich, Oxford, and the University of Arizona actually yielded a date range of 1260 through 1390 Common Era.
It doesn't affect the New Testament.
Actually,
Yeah,
hold on. I mean, Josias of Hebrew University of Jerusalem calls the shroud indisputably a fake. Not only is it a forgery, but it is a bad forgery. So, I mean, the reason.
I mean, to me, that's nothing. That does not have nothing to do with the New Testament. It's a completely different subject.
I've inspired you and Wolf are out of time for now, so we're going to head to the Q&A to see who all has questions. And Simon asked the first question. Question. So Simon, whoever you want to ask, go ahead.
Okay. Well, the first, it was a point I wanted to make a little while ago because it was in support of something IP said, which was there seems to be some modern archaeological evidence that under Roman occupation that the farmers in that region did pretty well. In fact, probably the best they'd done for some time. The stability of the Roman commerce really helped them. Then the second point was about the queue, which was if Mark is writing Peter's testament, then where can the queue be? Because Peter is as close to Jesus as you would want to get. So
That's a good question.
Doesn't really. Yeah.
I mean, well, yeah, I think the issue, remember, with Peter is that Peter was not writing a formal gospel in that sense. The early church fathers tell us, especially, like Papias, for example, tells us that there was, Irenaeus goes into more detail. He tells us that Peter was preaching in Rome, and some people approached Mark, the disciple of Peter, to write down what he was saying. Peter, when he heard this, neither approved nor disapproved. So Mark and Papias tell us that Peter would occasionally adapt his sermons depending on who he was speaking to. So what we kind of get from that is Peter was giving a sermon. It was not in with a sermon. You're gonna give more detail in some areas. You're not going to be as long as you would if you were writing a book or a full scroll like Matthew and Luke would. But you're going to give a sermon, and then Mark simply wrote that down, and that's where we get the Gospel of Mark from in that sense. Does that help?
It doesn't really say. I mean, my point really is that if there's a document that predates Mark, called the Q.
Oh, right. Sorry about that. I completely got sidetracked.
That can't be written by Peter, and so it must be someone presumably before Peter, around Peter.
Yeah, I don't actually believe in Q because I think oral tradition can fully explain the existence of Q. But what I was going at, and then I just completely forgot, was that Peter was giving a sermon. I mean, he wasn't necessarily trying to collect sources and give a book. He could have, if Q existed, he probably could have included some material in his sermon, left out other points that Mark and Luke would have included. He wasn't actually doing what Luke was doing, which was going around collecting eyewitness sources, early accounts, to write an account of what had laid out and fill an entire scroll. He was simply giving a sermon. So he could have just left it out because he didn't need it in his preaching, what he was trying to, tell the Romans at that point.
Does that answer your question, Simon?
Not the way I was asking it, but I think there's no point in going for a third try because, I think I'm maybe not expressing myself correctly. Maybe let other people get in, and if I can think of a better way of saying it, then maybe I'll ask it later.
Okay. Isalu has a question for Wolf. Is there any explanation why the gospel story would exist from an atheist perspective? And how does...
Could you repeat that? Could you repeat it again? I didn't hear it.
Okay. Is there any explanation why the gospel story would exist from an atheist perspective?
Is there any reason for the gospel to exist in an atheist perspective?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sure. I mean, we understand that people wrote these accounts. The problem is, or at least the reason why secular historians and skeptics tend to have a skeptical eye at it, is that please understand that the stories, they don't themselves don't account as eyewitness examples, since they came as the products of the mind of unknown authors and not from the characters themselves. The Gospels describe narrative stories written almost virtually in the third person. People who wish to portray themselves as eyewitnesses will write in the first person, not in the third person. Moreover, many of the passages attributed to Jesus could only have come from the invention of its authors. For example, many of the statements of Jesus claim to have come from him while allegedly alone. If so, who heard him? It becomes even more marked when the evangelists report or talk about what Jesus might have thought. But I mean, Jesus never really could bite at his thoughts. I mean, like, when did that actually happen? So the Gospels employ techniques that fictional writers actually use. In any case, Gospels can only serve best as just simple stories,
Yeah, just to quickly respond, I mean, the first person to ever bring up this argument to doubt the authorship of the Gospels was a guy by the name of Faustus, who St. Augustine responded to. So you have like plus 400 years by the time this argument actually comes up. And St. Augustine refuted this in his own words when he said, do we do this with other ancient documents? For example, we don't know who the Anabasis is written by Xenophon, but it speaks of Xenophon in third person. Same with Caesar's Wars. Josephus speaks of himself in third person. We don't doubt those for those reasons. And the majority, the old Boltmonian idea that the Gospels were myths is not really, it kind of died in the 20th century, early on. Most scholars nowadays take the account that they're written as basically as ancient Greco-Roman biographies in that sense.
All right, Charles, did you have a question? Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. My question is for Wolf. Do you believe that Jesus actually existed? And if not, how would you respond to the things that the Jews say in the Talmud about Jesus, the negative things they say about Jesus?
Well, just based off of the sources that we have for a historical Jesus, like I said, they're not really contemporary, and also the resources that come about, either they're biased in that they come from people who've already accepted the story or whatever. And to actually respond to what you said about the Talmud, and well, this actually what separates the Judaic faith from the Christian faith, in that the Jews just don't think that Jesus was was the Messiah. They don't think that he actually, met the criteria. Like, for example, with the Talmud. Amazingly, some Christians actually use brief portions of the Talmud, which is a collection of Jewish civil and religious law, including some contemporaries on the Torah as evidence for Jesus. They claim that Yeshua in the Talmud refers to Jesus. However, this Yeshua, according to scholars, depicts a disciple of Yohesa ben Parachia at least a century before the alleged Christian Jesus, or it may refer to Yesu ben Bandera, a teacher of the 2nd century Common Era. So regardless of how one's interpret this, the Palestinian Talmud didn't come into existence until the 3rd or 5th century Common Era, and the Babylonian Talmud between the 3rd and 6th century Common Era. So at least 2 centuries after the alleged crucifixion. At best, it can only serve as a controversial Christian or Jewish legend. It cannot serve as real, criticism either here nor there.
All right. Absolute. Do you have a question?
Yes, I guess this would be a question for IP. In the reliability of the New Testament, which is what we are discussing, I want to know your thoughts on the complete contradictions of the story of Jesus' birth between Matthew and Luke. They are so completely different that it almost speaks to the unreliability of the New Testament. Where you have in Luke, Jesus is presented to the temple within 40 days of his birth. Matthew, he's hiding out in Egypt for most of his childhood. So I'm just wondering, like this topic is the reliability, and I think this question speaks exactly to the reliability.
I am so glad you asked that question, because I am literally right in the middle of a series where I'm going through Bible contradictions. I have the first 3 up. I've already written 4 and 5, and
Okay.
4 is on, the supposed contradiction, where did Jesus go after his birth, Jerusalem or Egypt? Now, most of these, if you look at them, they can be resolved. I mean, it's to me, these are arguments from silence. The fact that Luke does not mention Egypt doesn't mean he didn't go there, and the fact that Matthew doesn't mention Jerusalem doesn't mean he didn't go there. The Jerusalem visit would have been a short visit. Bethlehem and Jerusalem were very close. They would have went him there to present the temple, would have returned back. In Luke, the fact that he doesn't mention it is not really a biggie. For example, Richard Burridge says that in his book, critics pointed out the lack of full treatment, childhood stories, psychological development, and so on in the Gospels. However, these aspects are also missing from other ancient biographies. So, example, I mentioned earlier the example of Josephus leaving out the expulsion in 49 AD. Huge event, Suetonius mentions. That doesn't mean they contradict. It just means they mention different events. And when Matthew and Luke are both about the size of a scroll, about the average size of what a scroll would be back then. So what you have to do is, when you're writing with that limit, you have to include some parts, take out some parts. You're going to write the parts that you think are best for the specific audience you're writing. Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, is going to mention important things of where Jesus fulfilled Old Testament passages. Luke, writing to a Gentile audience, doesn't have a need for that, and he can skip on ahead so he can include other parts. In Luke, for example, in his gospel, he leaves several gaps. That's not an issue. He leaves out Paul's time in Arabia. He leaves a 4-year gap between Acts 12 and 13. It was just his thing to leave out gaps. And it can be argued in Luke 2, he left out a short little gap, saying that they went to the temple and then they eventually returned. But that doesn't mean they contradicted one another. And you can go through these and you can look at them and you can see what they actually said. And if we judge it by the same time, criteria we would judge, the accounts of Alexander the Great between Plutarch and Arrian, we'd have to say that they're just mentioning different aspects of the same life.
Well, I would say that they're not exactly just leaving out parts. I mean, with one gospel saying that they went and hid in Egypt, it's not leaving out, well, they went to Egypt, but then they came back to present Jesus to the temple after 40 days, and then went back, to Egypt. I mean, these are actually contradicting.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Actually, what we get from Matthew is we get an indication that the flight to Egypt did not happen until a couple years later. For example, Matthew 2 opens up that after Jesus was born, the Magi were looking for him. So the Magi did not even arrive till a little bit later after that. And so in Herod, for example, when he has the slaughter go on, he orders all male children to be killed 2 and under. This implies that Jesus was a little older. So you have Jesus and Luke presented to the temple 8 days after. They remain in Bethlehem for a while, and there's a lot of evidence for that in Matthew itself. Then they go to Egypt, and then they come back a little bit later after that. So I would not say that in that order the way you gave it, but it can be argued the other order, and this is what most Christian scholars have taken, is that this is how the order would necessarily go, and we get that kind of indicated in how Matthew talks about when the Magi eventually came.
Okay.
All right, so does that answer your question?
Real quick, I'll have a video on that specifically. I think I'm going to try to have it up in June or July, but it's going to be about 5 minutes or so. It's going to be specifically on that, and I'll go into more detail on this. So.
All right, so June or July, everyone look out for Inspiring's video around that time, or subscribe to him. You'll be the first to know. Okay, so Janet, do you have a question for Wolf or Inspiring? Can you hear us, Janet? No,
I can't hear anything.
Yeah, I don't think she's got a mic.
Did you type it out?
Yeah, someone tell her to type the question out. Nephilim, do you have a question for any of them? Nephilim? Wow, everyone's just silent today. Alright, does anyone have a question?
Well, a question is purely from an ignorant stance here, but did Luke actually physically hear Peter preach?
I would say possibly, considering that we have him and Paul arrive in Rome in 60 AD. Peter probably arrived 58, 59 AD, and so they would have been in Rome together. And early church historians, like, for example, First Clement in 95 AD says they were both martyred in Rome together. So I wouldn't doubt that Luke heard Peter preaching. However, from internal evidence, it seems that Luke directly relied on the actual written document of Mark.
Yeah, I disagree. He actually, Luke, the author of Luke, actually admits himself as an interpreter of early material and not an actual eyewitness. And he also, there are some scholars actually think that the Gospel of Matthew and Luke actually came from the Mark Gospel, from Q. So there's actually some unreliability there with regard to actually trusting it, but
Alright. Okay, my question, I'm going to try to fit in so that way people can have some time to come up with their own questions or whatnot, or get in. My question is for Wolf. I mean, I guess this would go back to what, Charles said. So, hold on a second. Janet's got some bird or something that I can't hear unless she has a question. Then she can definitely.
Maybe Janet's bird has a question.
Maybe Janet's bird does have a question. You never know.
Who's a pretty boy then?
Okay, so Wolf. There are times where Jesus is mentioned by people besides, the Bible. Like, I believe William Lane Craig even said there was a Jewish scholar that even admits the crucifixion went on, and that's I guess they suppose is the evidence for the resurrection or the crucifixion, that even a Jewish scholar admits that Jesus was crucified and was all that. I mean, we've got all these different people there. I mean, you think that Jesus could be a real person?
Well, let's just go with let's just talk about the apologist Christians. They often cite these extra biblical sources, whether it be the Talmud, Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, or Josephus. However, they violate the rules of historiography by using the after event writings as evidence for the actual event itself. I mean, not one of these writers gives actual source or backs up a claim about evidential material about Jesus. Although one although we can provide numerous reasons why Christian and non-Christian sources prove spurious and argue endlessly about them, we can cut to the chase by simply determining the dates of the documents and birth dates of the authors. And it doesn't matter what these people wrote about Jesus. An author who writes after the alleged happening and gives no detectable sources for his material can only give examples of hearsay. So it's at best sketchy. All of these astronomic writings about Jesus could easily come from the beliefs and the stories of the Christian believers themselves. And even if like one would give some possible let's say throw a bone at for historical Jesus, like there could be a person for which these stories are based. The possibility of these things invoking supernatural events to the point that they can only occur once in human history is at best improbable on a high scale.
I think if you were going to apply that to the ancient historians as well, I mean, Josephus doesn't name all his sources. He just says, I got it from, I record this, I record that. That was just how ancient biographies were done. It's not like modern day where you have a bibliography and footnotes and all this. You had limited writing paper, so you just got all your information in. And you even have in ancient writers, people were quoting each other, and they were not even quoting the source. Today, that'd be plagiarism, but in the ancient world, that's how you wrote.
Yes, but the problem is, I mean, these all come necessarily well after the purported life of it, and yeah, I mean, you could certainly try to compare this vicinity to to famous people like let's see, Julius Caesar or like Alexander the Great, but there were still many other artifacts as well as statues and stuff that more or less substantiate them as real people, as opposed to this which is at best like a legendary figure at best.
Well, I mean, I could say the same with Hannibal, though, because we have no artifacts of Hannibal. We only have Roman sources of him. Later, I mean, hundreds of years. I think about 150, I think, is the closest we get to Hannibal. I think it's 150 plus, but I'd have to check on that. But I know it's not within his lifetime, and they're only Roman. We have no Carthaginian sources. We only have one source that he crossed the Alps with elephants. That seems quite a feat. But we have no archaeological evidence of that. Not even the path he took.
All right. So, I guess after Nephilim's thing, we're gonna allow a couple more questions. But so we're gonna do this. Then we'll get to our questions. But till then, we're gonna take a little quick sponsor break. And here is our sponsor, Nephilim Free. Nephilim, say whatever you have to say for the comment, man, but make it brief.
Okay, thanks. No, I'll just make a brief comment. I'll be real brief. I think the evidence, of course, for the existence of Jesus, I'm still marvel when I hear an atheist argue that the evidence is slim. There's more evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ than any historical person in the world. I mean, there's mountains, tens of thousands of documents written about him before 500 A.D. It's unbelievable, the evidence that exists. But and also, I would say the early church fathers were in complete unanimous agreement about what books were inspired and which were not by the late 200s. So anyone arguing that after before 200, the late 200, like 280, 275, 85, that by that time there was still a lot of argument amongst the church fathers as to, well, I don't know, is the evidence for that one inspired good or not? That argument is out. There was complete unanimous agreement amongst church fathers by the late 200s about what books were inspired. I just wanted to point that out. Thanks for letting me comment.
All right, no problem, man. All right.
Yeah, just to respond to that real quick. I mean, yes, I mean the editing and formation of the Bible came from the members of the early Christian church. But since the fathers of the church possessed the scriptura and determined what would appear in the Bible, there occurred plenty of opportunity and motivation to change, modify, or create text that might bolster the position of the church or the members of the church themselves. And since in attempting to salvage the Bible, the respected revisionists and scholars, particularly Bruce Measure, actually has written extensively on the problems of the New Testament in his book, The Text of the New Testament. Errors arising from faulty eyesight, errors of the mind and stuff like that. Since the church had such power over people that to question the church could result in death regardless of which the church claimed, most people simply believed what their priest told them. You know, despite these errors, even Martin Luther actually questioned various parts of it.
Yeah, the idea that there was some sort of political control over here is not really backed up, considering we have multiple lines of transmission. We find manuscripts outside, and the early church was a small persecuted minority. By the time of Constantine came to power, only 5% of the empire was Christian at that point. They are persecuted, spread out minority. There was multiple lines of transmission outside of the Roman Empire, inside of the Roman Empire, and if there were these political corruptions in the text, we would be able to see that because we'd have manuscript evidence of doctrinal changes being added in. And as even Bart Ehrman admits, that no textual variants affect any of our Christian doctrines in that sense. We're completely, and the reason we know that is because we have these multiple lines of transmission, all spreading out, going into different regions, having different controls. It's not like with Islam, where the third caliph collected all the manuscripts of the Quran, made a final copy, and then burned the rest, to make sure there was one set tradition. And we don't have that in Christianity. It was spread out from the beginning. It went everywhere, and we know there was no way to control it, even up till even after Nicaea, because it existed outside of the empire.
Yes, but in terms of actual history, I mean, what we have is people that actually admit to there being deception for the church. In the letter to Napoleon, Jerome writes about his teacher Gregory of Nazianzus. When he asked about him to explain a phrase in Luke, he evaded his request by saying, "I will tell you about it in church, and there, when all people applaud me, you will be forced against your will to know what you do not know at all. For if you alone remain silent, everyone will put you down for a fool." And he responds with, "There is nothing so easy as by sheer volupty to deceive a common crowd or an uneducated congregation." And actually, in the 5th century, John Chrysostom, in his treatise on the priesthood in Book 1, wrote, "And often it is necessary to deceive and do the greatest benefits by means of this deceit, whereas he who has gone by a straight course has done great mischief to the person to whom he has not deceived." Okay, I mean, we have, with such admission to accepting lies, the burning of radical texts, Bible errors, and alterations, how could any honest scholar take any book of the New Testament as absolute, much less using these extraneous texts that support churches in actual...
prior to that, though, that predate these things, and the fact that St. Jerome doesn't say anything, he says, "I'll tell you in church," is not a admission that there's some sort of conspiracy going on. I mean, that's just an argument from silence in that sense. And these are much later writers coming in. I mean, I can go back to earlier church fathers like Irenaeus, Papias, Eusebius, all of these in manuscript evidence that predates it. Manuscript evidence that, we have the entire New Testament, we have the Codex Sinaiticus to prior, long before that. And we can compare it with Alexandrian traditions, with Codex, A, for example. We can compare it with all of that. And, that's how we decide what is true and what is not. We have even earlier fragments, almost complete copies of Luke and John, like in, P75, for example. So, I mean, this just seems like what I said in the beginning, just like, just what if the mere skepticism argument? What if this happened? I mean, we don't do this with other ancient documents. Just the mere possibility that there's a conspiracy going on is not evidence that there actually is. I mean, that's just taking a little bit of skepticism and running wild with it.
Well, because most other historical documents do not contain supernaturalism or magic.
Yes, they do.
So.
Yes,
I mean,
they do.
but we know those are not correct if they're mystical.
Yeah.
Like
and
we don't lend credence to mythical stories of Zeus and Mount Olympus. We understand that they are stories, but we don't argue the validity of those stories.
Right, and I'm not arguing for the truth at this point. I'm only arguing for the reliability. I can agree that that Zeus is not an actual real god, and those were just stories written. But I can agree they're reliable to what the original people believed. That's a little bit different of what I'm trying to argue for here. Now we can get into cases of miracles and whatnot, but just about every ancient author mentions miracles. Tacitus, Suetonius mentions more than Tacitus. Josephus does. Herodotus, the father of Greek history, does. Just about every. I mean, I think that the exception is when we find an author who doesn't mention miracles. We don't.
Yeah, but
just,
because
this is only. Yeah,
they're,
keep in mind. Let's
they're
keep
writing
in mind.
about things that they heard.
Yes, exactly. Keep in mind that this only is the case after it's established. Okay, and a lot of them are getting their information from the believers themselves, if not from just non-contemporary like views. I mean, this is the problem with actually trusting it. And during the actual life of Jesus, because there's a particular astronomical event that would have attracted the attention of anyone interested in the heavens, according to Luke 23, verse 44 and 45, there occurred about the 6th hour, and there was darkness all over the world until the 9th hour, and the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was rent in the mist. Yet not a single mention of such a 3-hour ecliptic event got recorded by anyone.
Okay, that's an argument.
Including the astronomers and astrologers anywhere in the world, including Pliny the Younger and Sindenigo, who both recorded eclipses from other dates.
First of all,
also that for obvious reasons, they can't, like solar eclipses can't occur during a full moon. So.
Well, first of all, they did not record extensive accounts. They were not writing extensive accounts of eclipses, and Luke does not say what type of darkness. He doesn't imply this was a supernatural darkness. He doesn't say it was all over the world. He says it was over the land. It could have just been cloud cover for that. It just says darkness was all over. I mean, you could say it got really dark when we had this really bad storm. None of the gospel authors imply this was supernatural in that sense. And again, this is just an argument from silence. We have one ancient historian who mentions the eruption of Pompeii, the destruction of Pompeii. And the only reason Pliny mentions it is because his uncle died in it. If his uncle died in it, we would never even heard of it. We've only found an archaeological evidence. But this is just, to me, the same argument from silence. If we apply this to Roman historians, we have to throw out Hannibal crossing the Alps because we only have one source. The fact of the matter is we have just a couple, maybe a bookcase full of ancient writings from the 1st century at this point, and we don't dismiss it. Because, for example, Marco Polo went through China, documented all where he went and everything. Doesn't mention the Great Wall of China. Doesn't mention the tea districts. That doesn't mean they don't exist or they didn't exist. Just because an author is silent on something, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. That's a fallacy that's used in history often, and you need to be. It cannot be. If it's going to apply to the New Testament, you got to apply it everywhere else, and we got to throw out at least 90% of our history in that.
Well, it's not so much that the evidence is just isn't good enough. It just isn't so much to rule any of the just the implications in. Like, I mean, just Matthew 2 describes Herod and all of Jerusalem as troubled by the worship of the infant Jesus. Herod then had all of the children of Bethlehem slain. If such extraordinary infanticide of this magnitude had occurred, why didn't anyone write about it? I mean, some apologists attempt to dig themselves out of this problem by claiming that there lived no capable historians during that period, or due to the lack of education of
I wouldn't claim that.
people with a writing capacity, or even sillier, the scarcity of paper gave reason why no one recorded their Savior. But the area in and surrounding Jerusalem served, in fact, as a center of education and record-keeping for the Jewish people. The Romans, of course, also kept many records. Moreover, the Gospels mention scribes many times, not only as followers of Jesus, but the scribes connected with the high priests. And as for historians, there lived plenty at the time who had the capacity and capability to record, not just gossip or pass down stories or anything like that, but specific significant events, especially from a religious sect who drew a lot of attention through this supposed entity of Jesus. I mean, you could take, for example, the works of Philo Judaeus, also known as Philo of Alexander, whose birth occurred around 20 before the Common Era and died around 50 with the Common Era. He lived as the greatest Jewish Hellenistic philosopher and historian of the time, and lived in the area of Jerusalem during the life of Jesus. He wrote very detailed accounts of Jewish events that occurred in that surrounding area at the time. Yet not once in all of his volumes of writings do we read of the particular account of the Christ. So,
well, he probably didn't believe he was.
Nor do we get that from Seneca or Pliny the Younger.
All right, hey guys, we gotta wrap it up with 2 more questions. And Keithley's, our favorite Canadian, has a question. So, let's see what you got, Keith.
Yeah, I got a question for my pal Wolf King, man.
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, well, my question is pretty simple. Well, we've been arguing all these different, does God exist and everything for who knows how long, and I heard you guys discuss the validity of these gospels and that, right? Well, my question is, you know, don't you think that with the whole validity thing, if it was that easy to prove that it was all false, then, like, why are we still arguing it? Like I always say that if it was that easy to disprove, it would have been disproven already. So why do you think that this, religion is still around, hasn't been defeated yet by all the modern science, the philosophy, and all that? Like, I understand there's going to be people that don't believe. That's just, life. But at the same time, why is it still around if it's that false? Just pretty.
It's not so much that that it can that it's to be disproved or something like that. I mean, personally, there's actually room to think that social movements and various political aspects, regarded to actually maintaining Christianity as a major religion, actually took place, along with what Constantine did, with establishing it through the, I believe, Treaty of Milan, which allowed it to be free to actually influence and spread and stuff like that, as well as certain cultural layers with regard to the Roman Empire, posts and stuff like that, which caused it to diversify. Then you got the thoughts of Martin Luther and how he thought that some of these epistles were capable of being thrown out, or at least being scrutinized, with just a more rational eye at this. So it's not so much that it's disproved, and actually you could say that there is a degree happening at that now in terms of secularization. There are more people that tend to look outside of religion for authoritative positions on issues that impact their lives and such like that. But honestly, if people want to take from this, a belief, like a term of faith from this, that's fine. But I think like faith would be the best way to put it. I mean, even if one could say that there was a historical person for which these stories are based on, or several people, like, it's not like the odds of whether or not they invoked any type of superstitious elements or magic or anything like that, I would say is highly probable, if not impossible.
All right.
All right. Thanks for answering my question, man.
All right.
Anytime.
DJ, you got a question?
Yeah, my question is for IP. And you have to excuse me if this has already been covered because I did miss a good portion of this. But how many original, partial, or complete Greek manuscripts were in existence of the early New Testament books? Like, I would say, like towards the beginning of the year, like between the first 500 years of Christianity.
How many manuscripts were there?
Yeah, how many manuscripts were floating around?
Well, we don't actually know for sure. All we know is what we have left, and we have thousands of Greek. I think we have we're approaching 6,000 manuscripts that we found from the ancient world. Now with the prior to Nicaea and all that. I mean, we don't know because we have reports of Romans burning Christian scriptures in Alexandria and in Rome and during different persecutions. We know a lot of manuscripts were persecuted during the really great persecution just before Constantine took over. So, when it comes to that, I mean, we've lost so much from different persecutions in that sense that we don't actually know how much we're floating around in that sense. However, despite that, we still have more of the New Testament than we do of any other ancient document by a substantial amount. I mean, even Bart Ehrman admits that it's substantial compared to any other ancient work with what we have left over in that sense. So, as terms of numbers, I've heard somewhere anywhere between 100 to 1,000, depending on who you're talking about. Because you have to understand, I mean, Tertullian testifies that when the Christians would come to visit Rome and they would take a copy of the Book of Romans that Paul wrote to Rome back to their church, and then someone else would come to Rome and they would take a copy back to their church, and this spread out. This happened, for the first 300 years for a long time, and he testifies that some of the original documents were still around when he was writing. So, I mean, we know it went a lot of places, and we're still finding old manuscripts that we're digging up from that era. There's a report of a first-century Mark that was recently discovered, and it's going to be published soon. So, I mean,
Yeah,
that'd be.
I've
Yeah, go
heard
ahead.
that there's Syriac, Armenian, Coptic manuscripts floating around, amongst
Mhm.
other things. What I have heard some apologists do, and here's my follow-up to that, is they have compared the amount of manuscripts that are floating around that we're finding, and usually they're partials, but they're comparing it to the amount of manuscripts that we can find for Homer's Odyssey. And have you heard that kind of like apologist route?
Yeah, it's actually the Iliad they usually compare with.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the Iliad, my bad.
Hmm.
And so I've heard, and now maybe I'm wrong, but I heard that it was about close to 5K um,
Oh yeah, it's
for
over.
Christian and around 2K for the Iliad.
I think the last time I checked, it's almost 6,000. It's getting close to 6,000 for the New Testament, and then for the Iliad, I think it's between 1,000 and 2,000 as of now. And then behind that, I think the third is like about 200 manuscripts.
Well, yeah, that argument's not a quantity thing. It's an attestation. How far removed from when it was written do you have the extant copy of it?
Yeah, yeah.
That's where it's far removed.
So I'm not like using it to prove, but I think it's very interesting to know that, like, how do we know? How do we know how accurate this is? A lot of people are worried about how accurate the New Testament is, and I think that if we can find more bits and pieces, I think it makes it a lot more interesting to talk about how accurate the New Testament is.
Oh, and I agree completely. This is how we were able to identify variants and get back to the original reading that I discussed in my part 2 of the New Testament reliability series I'm doing, is that because we have so much manuscript, we have so much evidence and so many different lines of transmission going out that we can study this and find out and get closer and closer to back to what the original was. And it's the best of any ancient document, as you pointed out.
All right. Wow, this was an interesting show. Inspiring, man. What did you think? Was this what you were expecting for the topic?
This is exactly what I was expecting. It's, as I said in the opening, the arguments against the New Testament reliability are always mere skepticism and double standard with other ancient works. If we're going to apply those arguments of silence to Josephus, to Scipio the Younger, to Herodotus, we would throw out so much of ancient history. I could just sit here and list examples all night of why didn't this author mention this? Why did he mention this? Why did he mention, it just could go on, but.
All right, Wolf, what are your thoughts on the chat that y'all have?
I thought it was a fairly interesting topic. I mean, and I'll admit, although the New Testament does mention various cities, geological sites, and kings and people that existed and lived during the alleged lives of some people, including Jesus, there still exist certain anomalies that I feel need to actually be taken into account when talking about these things. I mean, likewise, just because the Gospels mention cities and locations of Judea that known historical people, this the exact certain scriptures like John 12-21 says that the same came therefore to Philip, which was of the Sea of Galilee, was resided in Galileans, the Golden region east of the Jordan River, not Galilee, which resided west of the river. And John 3:23 says John also was baptized in Antioch near Salem. Critics agree that no such place as Antioch exists near Salem. So I mean, it's things like this that, as well as like a city named Nazareth that supposedly exists, but doesn't necessarily appear in the Old Testament and stuff like that. It's things like this that we need to catch on, and if we're going to call some things facts and evidence, we need to be actually sure that this actually weighs up to actual standards of historicity and whether or not we call this fact from mere beliefs or faith. So I think that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about these things. And other than that, I think this was a very nice talk. I'm happy to participate.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm glad that Wolf was willing to come and do this. I really enjoyed it.
Oh yeah, it was very nice.
All right, and the existence philosopher, he typed this in leet language. said hello, and that he wished he could have made it to the chat, but we're about to close up. We always do a little prayer thing at the end of these, so Deidre, my favorite annihilationist, Christian sister, would you like to do
Lol.
this?
Okay. So you want us to close? Okay, I'll try to be shorter than usual.
Okay.
Okay, let's pray. Father God, I just thank you for just allowing people to be willing to discuss differences in an open and controlled forum, respectfully, God. And I just pray that that we seek the truth no matter what. And God, I just pray a blessing upon everybody, and I just pray that that you inspire us all to keep continuing to seek the truth no matter what, nonstop. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Alright, so, and I found Absolute said he's not closing his eyes. That's okay, you can keep them open or closed. God ain't gonna judge you if you're a closed-eyed or an open-eyed prayer guy. But anyways, that's all we got till then, so until the next time we do one of these, Shalom Aleichem, which means peace be upon you, and literally, peace be upon you.
Peace out.